The casino floated in the middle of deep space, a massive structure glowing with neon lights. It was known across the galaxy as the Star's Fortune, where only the richest and most powerful beings came to gamble. Inside, creatures from different worlds sat around golden tables, their eyes focused on the games of chance. At the center of the casino, Psylocke the Conqueror sat with a smug grin. He was a tall, reptilian alien with dark blue scales and sharp golden eyes. He had won every game that night. His wealth and power made him arrogant, and he enjoyed proving that no species was smarter than his own. The crowd around him watched in awe. His opponents had lost everything: credits, starships, entire planets. No one could beat him. Then a human stepped forward. Daniel Carter. He was not rich, he was not powerful, but he was smart. He had traveled across the galaxy, making a name for himself in the gambling world, not by luck, but by skill. Psylocke laughed when he saw him. A human, here to challenge me. His voice was deep, mocking. I admire your courage, but this is no place for your kind. Daniel simply smiled and took a seat across from him. I thought this was a place for winners. Or are you afraid of a simple game? The crowd gasped. No one had ever spoken to Psylocke like that. The alien warlord's grin disappeared. He leaned forward, his sharp claws tapping against the table. I never lose. Daniel shrugged. Then you have nothing to worry about. A robotic dealer rolled onto the table. Welcome to the final gamble. Place your bets. Psylocke smirked. I will make this easy for you, human. I'll bet 1,000 star credits. Daniel shook his head. Not interesting enough. He pushed forward a small bag of glowing blue gems, rare and priceless in the galaxy. I bet all of this. The crowd murmured. It was a bold move. Psylocke chuckled. Fine. I'll raise the stakes. He pulled out a data chip and placed it on the table. This contains ownership of a warship, worth 10 times your gems. Daniel remained calm. Still not enough. Psylocke's eyes narrowed. Then what do you want, human? Daniel pointed across the room. At Luraya. She stood near the edge of the casino floor, watching everything in silence. She was tall and elegant, with silver skin and glowing violet eyes. She wore a long royal robe, a sign that she belonged to someone powerful. Psylocke's smirk returned. You want my wife? He laughed loudly. Do you even understand what you are asking? Daniel's expression did not change. Do you? The crowd whispered. This was madness. Psylocke's wife was not just a woman. She was a symbol of his status, a prize he had won long ago. Psylocke leaned back, amused. Very well, human. If you win, you get my wife. But when I win, I take everything you have. Daniel nodded. Deal. The robotic dealer activated the game. A holographic war board appeared on the table. This was not a game of luck. It was a game of strategy, tactics, and intelligence. The game began. Psylocke made his first move, confident as always. He placed his holographic pieces, creating a perfect defensive line. Daniel studied the board carefully before making his move. Minutes passed. The crowd held its breath. Psylocke was winning. His strategy was flawless, his movements fast and precise. Daniel remained silent, his face unreadable. Then something changed. Daniel started making unusual moves. At first, they seemed random. But as the game continued, the pattern became clear. Psylocke had fallen into a trap. The alien warlord frowned. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Daniel smiled slightly. Your move. Psylocke's claws gripped the table. He was running out of options. He tried to counterattack, but Daniel had already planned for it. Another move. Another loss. The final moment arrived. Daniel placed his last piece on the board. The winning move. The holographic display flickered, announcing his victory. The casino went silent. Daniel had won. Psylocke's face twisted in disbelief. He slammed his fist on the table, shaking the glasses and chips. Impossible. The robotic dealer confirmed the result. Game over. Winner, Daniel Carter. The crowd exploded in cheers and gasps. No one had ever seen Psylocke lose before. Daniel stood up and turned toward Luraya. She stepped forward slowly, her glowing violet eyes meeting his. Psylocke growled. "This is not over, human." Daniel smirked. "It never is." The casino lights flickered, the tension in the air sharp as a knife. The real game had only just begun. The casino's neon lights flickered, casting a strange glow over the stunned crowd. No one had ever seen Psylocke lose, and now, for the first time, the mighty conqueror sat frozen, his sharp claws digging into the table. His golden eyes burned with rage, flickering between Daniel and the robotic dealer that had just announced the unthinkable. The human had won. Silence hung thick in the air. Luraya stepped forward, her violet eyes fixed on Daniel. She was unreadable, her expression calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the ceremonial bracelet around her wrist. It was a symbol of her bond to Psylocke, and now it belonged to someone else. Psylocke's lips curled in fury. "You think this game means anything, human?" His voice was low, dangerous. Daniel held his gaze, unshaken. A deal is a deal. The crowd tensed. Even the robotic dealer hesitated before responding. According to the Galactic Code of Wagered Property, Luraya is now legally transferred to the winner, Daniel Carter. Psylocke shot up from his seat, his chair screeching against the polished floor. "You dare take my wife?" His voice echoed across the casino. "This is an insult. The disgrace." Daniel didn't flinch. "You set the terms. I just played the game." Psylocke's breathing grew heavy. His scaled hands flexed, his claws twitching with restrained aggression. The reptilian guards at the edge of the casino took a step forward, their weapons humming to life. For a moment, Daniel thought Psylocke might attack him right then and there. But then, something unexpected happened. Luraya removed the bracelet herself. She stepped forward, holding it in her palm. Slowly, deliberately, she dropped it onto the table between them. The metal clinked against the smooth surface, a small but deafening sound in the quiet room. "I belong to no one," she said softly. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Daniel was surprised. Psylocke's fists clenched, his jaw tightening. "You are my property," he hissed. "You swore loyalty to me." Luraya met his gaze without fear. "You won me in a game once. Now you've lost me the same way." For the first time, Psylocke had no words. His chest rose and fell with barely contained fury. His pride had been shattered. His power challenged. Daniel took a slow breath, keeping his expression calm even as his mind raced. This was a dangerous situation. He had expected Psylocke to be angry, but he hadn't expected this level of hostility. The casino's security droids hovered nearby, their blue lights flashing. A silent warning to Psylocke. Violence was not tolerated here. If he tried anything, he would be removed by force. Still, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Psylocke was not going to let this go. The alien warlord inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stand straighter. He turned his gaze to Daniel, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but far more dangerous. "You may have won this round, human," he said, his golden eyes glinting with dark promise. "But this isn't over. I will take back what is mine. And when I do, you will beg me for mercy." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "I don't beg." Psylocke bared his teeth. Then, without another word, he turned sharply and stormed out of the casino, his guards following close behind. The tension in the room slowly eased as murmurs spread through the crowd. Daniel let out a slow breath, then turned to Luraya. "So, now what?" She studied him for a long moment. "That depends," she said. "Where are we going?" Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected her to ask that. "I hadn't thought that far ahead." Luraya smirked. "Typical human." He sighed. Look, if you have somewhere you'd rather be, I'm not keeping you. But if Tylox really wants to come after us, I'd rather not be standing still when he does." Lurea's smirk faded slightly. She looked back toward the entrance of the casino, as if expecting Tylox to come rushing back in. Then she nodded. "All right, human. Let's get moving." Daniel didn't waste another second. The two of them disappeared into the shadows of the station, unaware that Tylox was already setting his revenge in motion. The space station's metallic corridors stretched endlessly, dimly lit by flickering neon panels. The hum of machinery and distant chatter of alien voices filled the air as Daniel and Luria weaved through the maze of walkways. Neither spoke for a long time. The weight of what had just happened at the casino still hung between them. Daniel stole a glance at Luria. She walked with silent confidence, her violet eyes scanning their surroundings. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. He couldn't tell if she was relieved to be free from Tylox or just trading one problem for another. "Do you even have a plan?" Luria finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "If I said yes, I'd be lying." Luria stopped walking, turning to face him. "You just won a warlord's wife in a bet, and you don't have a plan." Daniel shrugged. "I was kinda hoping you'd have some ideas." She narrowed her eyes at him. "You really don't understand what's coming, do you?" "Oh, I get it," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "Tylox is mad, and he's going to come after us. The guy isn't exactly subtle." Luria shook her head. "It's worse than that. You embarrassed him in front of the entire station. Tylox isn't just powerful, he's feared. He has influence. Allies. You made him look weak, and in his world, weakness is a death sentence. He has to come after us now. If he doesn't, someone else will take him down first." Daniel frowned. He hadn't thought of that. It wasn't just about revenge for Tylox. It was about survival. That meant he wouldn't just send a couple of thugs to rough them up. He'd come with everything he had. "Great," Daniel muttered. "So what you're saying is, I should have just lost." Luria studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "No. If you lost, he wouldn't have let you walk away. He would have made an example out of you." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Well, that's comforting." Footsteps echoed down the corridor behind them. Not casual ones, heavy, deliberate, approaching fast. Luria's expression darkened. "We need to move. Now." Daniel didn't argue. He followed as she darted toward a side passage, blending into the crowd. He glanced back and spotted two massive enforcers pushing through the sea of people. Their armor gleamed under the station's lights, their eyes scanning for any sign of their targets. Tylox wasn't wasting any time. Daniel and Luria turned a corner, slipping into a dimly lit service tunnel. The air smelled of burning circuits and coolant leaks. The hum of power lines vibrated through the walls. "Where are we going?" Daniel whispered. Luria crouched near a control panel, pressing a few buttons. The door behind them sealed shut. "A friend. Someone who can get us off this station before Tylox catches up." Daniel leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "And this friend, they're not just gonna turn us in, right?" Luria shot him a look. "Not if they value their life." Before Daniel could respond, the ground beneath them shook. A distant explosion rumbled through the station, making the walls tremble. Luria cursed under her breath. "He's not just sending enforcers, he's taking the whole damn station hostage." Daniel's stomach twisted. Tylox wasn't just looking for payback. He was making sure no one helped them. They were running out of time. The lights flickered as another explosion rocked the station. A deep mechanical alarm blared overhead, warning everyone of an escalating emergency. The air smelled of burning metal, and distant shouts filled the hallways. Daniel could feel the tension in the station shift. Civilians were panicking, security forces were scrambling, and somewhere in the chaos, Tylox's men were closing in. Luria pulled Daniel forward, her grip tight around his wrist. "We have to move." He's sealing off exits. If we don't get off this station now, we never will. Daniel's mind raced. He had never seen an alien warlord throw an entire station into lockdown just to hunt one person down. Or two. That meant Psylocke wasn't thinking logically anymore. He wasn't just trying to take back Lariah. He was trying to erase the humiliation Daniel had caused him. And that made him dangerous. They reached an old maintenance shaft, the air thick with coolant mist. Lariah knelt by the control panel, rapidly inputting commands. Daniel glanced behind them, half expecting to see Psylocke's men charging through the hallway. The station's corridors were alive with flashing red lights and chaotic voices, but no one seemed to be paying attention to them yet. "Tell me this friend of yours has a ship," Daniel muttered. Lariah didn't look up. "She does, and she owes me a favor. Big enough to take on an entire warlord's army." Lariah hesitated just long enough for Daniel to not like the answer. The panel beeped, and the maintenance shaft door hissed open. Lariah grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him inside. The narrow tunnel stretched into darkness, dimly lit by flickering guidance lights. The space was cramped, forcing them to move in single file. "How do you know this person?" Daniel asked, crawling behind her. Lariah hesitated. "She helped me once, when I first came to the station." Daniel caught the slight shift in her voice. There was a story there, one she wasn't ready to tell. But now wasn't the time to push for details. The tunnel sloped downward before opening into a dimly lit storage room. The scent of engine fuel and metal grease filled the air. Large crates were stacked against the walls, and in the center of the room stood a sleek, heavily modified starship. And at the base of the ship's ramp stood a woman. She was tall, with midnight blue skin and piercing silver eyes. A long coat draped over her shoulders, and an energy pistol rested at her hip. She had the sharp, calculating look of someone who had seen more battles than she cared to remember. Lariah exhaled in relief. "Naira." The woman's gaze flicked to Lariah, then to Daniel. She arched an eyebrow. "I assume this has something to do with the explosions." Lariah forced a smile. "You could say that." Naira sighed, crossing her arms. "You're not going to make this easy for me, are you?" Daniel stepped forward. "Look, I know we're asking a lot, but we need to get out of here now. Psylocke isn't playing games. He's coming for us, and he's willing to burn this station to the ground to do it." Naira studied them for a long moment. Then, without a word, she turned and started up the ramp. "Get on. If we're doing this, we don't have time to argue." Daniel and Lariah exchanged a glance before following her aboard. The ship's interior was compact but built for speed. Every control panel hummed with power, and the navigation system was already prepped for launch. Naira slid into the pilot's seat, fingers flying across the controls. "Strap in," she said. "This is going to get rough." The ship's engines roared to life, vibrating beneath their feet. The docking bay doors groaned open, revealing the cold void of space beyond. Then, an alert flashed across the screen. "Damn it," Naira muttered. "They've activated a lockdown." Daniel's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means," Lariah said grimly, "Psylocke just made sure no ship leaves this station." Outside the viewport, station security ships were already positioning themselves around the hangar, blocking their escape. Daniel swallowed hard. They weren't out of this yet. The ship trembled under the pressure of the station's security field. The engines roared, pushing against the invisible force holding them in place. They were trapped. Daniel gritted his teeth as he strapped himself into the co-pilot's seat, his hands gripping the harness tight. Lariah sat beside him. Tension etched across her face. Behind them, Naira worked furiously at the controls, her silver eyes darting over the flickering redouts. "They've sealed the entire hangar," Naira growled. "No ship is getting through unless we disable the lockdown." Daniel exhaled sharply. "And how do we do that?" Naira tapped the control panel. A schematic of the space station appeared, highlighting a security hub on the upper levels. "That's our way out. If we can override the field, We'll have a small window before they reactivate it. Daniel glanced at Lariah. She was already unstrapping herself. Then let's go. Nara turned in her seat, her expression serious. We'll have to move fast. Psylocke isn't going to sit around and let you waltz into his security hub. Daniel smirked. Then we won't waltz. We'll run. They moved through the service corridors, keeping to the shadows as alarms blared across the station. The warlord's men were everywhere now, their armor-clad figures storming through hallways, weapons at the ready. Psylocke wasn't just sending grunts, he had deployed his elite enforcers. Lariah pressed her back against a bulkhead, peering around a corner. 2 guards, heavily armed. Daniel exhaled, his heart pounding. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but they had one advantage. Psylocke didn't expect them to be reckless. Give me your knife, Daniel whispered. Lariah hesitated, then handed him a small curved blade. Daniel flipped it in his grip before turning to Nara. Can you distract them? Nara smirked. Watch and learn. She reached into her coat, pulled out a small pulse grenade, and casually rolled it down the hallway. The guards barely had time to react before the device detonated with a blinding flash. Daniel and Lariah moved. In the confusion, Daniel struck first, driving the blade into the first guard's shoulder. The alien roared in pain, but before he could recover, Lariah delivered a swift kick to his head, knocking him out cold. The second guard recovered quickly, raising his blaster, but Nara was faster. A single shot rang out, and the guard collapsed. Daniel wiped his brow. I'd say that went well. Nara stepped over the unconscious bodies. I'd say you're lucky. Lariah didn't waste time. She grabbed one of the guard's key cards and rushed to the security door. She swiped the card, and the console blinked green. The door slid open, revealing a control room filled with blinking terminals and flashing monitors. But they weren't alone. Standing at the center of the room, arms crossed and a cold smirk on his face, was Psylocke. And he wasn't alone. Flanking him were 4 enforcers, their weapons trained on the intruders. The warlord tilted his head, his glowing red eyes locking onto Lariah. I knew you'd come, Psylocke said smoothly. I counted on it. Lariah stiffened, her fingers twitching toward her belt. Psylocke chuckled. You always were predictable, my dear. His gaze shifted to Daniel. And you, the foolish human who thinks he's won something. Daniel clenched his fists. I don't think I won. I did. Psylocke's smirk widened. Did you? With a snap of his fingers, the enforcers fired. Daniel barely had time to react before Nara tackled him behind a control panel. Blaster bolts ricocheted off metal surfaces, sparks flying in all directions. Lariah dove for cover, rolling behind a console as the room erupted into chaos. Daniel ducked low, his pulse racing. Psylocke wasn't playing around anymore. He was done with games. And now it was a fight for survival. Lariah reached for her blaster and fired 3 rapid shots. 2 of the enforcers dropped instantly, but the remaining guards were quick to retaliate. Daniel barely avoided a shot that seared the console beside his head. Nara was already moving. She vaulted over a console, firing midair, taking out another enforcer before she landed smoothly on the floor. But Psylocke didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand, and the room trembled. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The warlord wasn't just strong. He had abilities. Lariah's blaster was ripped from her hands by an invisible force, flying across the room. Nara staggered as the very air grew heavy, pressing down on them. Psylocke stepped forward, his eyes glowing brighter. You think this is over? Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. His body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Psylocke smirked. You took something from me. Now, I will take everything from you. Daniel refused to back down. Through sheer will, he forced himself forward, step by step. The weight pressing down on him was suffocating, but he pushed on. He wasn't going to lose. Not after everything. Not now. Luraya struggled beside him, her face twisted in pain, but she refused to fall. Daniel's eyes met hers, and in that moment, they knew. They had one last move, one chance, and they had to take it. Now. The station shook with the force of Xylox's power. Lights flickered, warning sirens blared, and the very air seemed to crackle with energy. Daniel could feel it pressing against him, like an invisible hand crushing his chest. But he refused to give in. Xylox stood in the center of the chaos, his eyes glowing with raw power, his robes billowing as unseen forces swirled around him. His enforcers lay defeated, but he didn't seem the least bit concerned. If anything, he looked amused. "You truly think you can win, human?" Xylox's voice was eerily calm, carrying an almost mocking tone. "You stole my prize, humiliated me in my own domain. Did you believe there would be no consequences?" Daniel steadied his breath, tightening his grip on the blaster in his hands. Luraya was beside him. Her expression hardened. Naira crouched behind a console, gripping a small blade, her usual smirk replaced by grim determination. "We don't think we can win," Daniel said, stepping forward. "We know we will." Xylox's laughter echoed through the chamber. Bold words for a man seconds away from death. With a flick of his wrist, the room exploded with energy. A shockwave erupted outward, sending Daniel and the others flying. He hit the ground hard, his vision blurring as pain shot through his ribs. Sparks rained down from the broken ceiling, and the control panels flickered wildly. The security hub was falling apart. Daniel struggled to his feet, his ears ringing. Xylox was too strong. Luraya coughed as she pulled herself up, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. "We need to move. We can't fight him like this." Naira groaned, pushing herself off the ground. "Then what's the plan, genius?" "Because I'm fresh out of ideas." Daniel's mind raced. The security system was still active. If they could override the mainframe, they could shut down the gravity stabilizers in this section of the station, which meant Xylox would be just as vulnerable as they were. "Luraya, get to the control panel," Daniel shouted. "We're going to take the fight to him on our terms." She nodded, sprinting toward the console, while Naira covered her, firing at Xylox to distract him. The warlord barely flinched. He simply raised his hand, and the blaster bolt stopped midair, then turned back toward them. Daniel's heart pounded. "Move." They dove for cover as their own shots came flying back at them, blasting holes in the walls. Xylox stepped forward, shaking his head. "Pathetic," he muttered. "You mortals always rely on your toys, but you do not understand true power." He lifted his hand again, and Daniel felt himself being pulled off the ground. An invisible force wrapped around his throat, lifting him higher and higher. Daniel gasped, his hands clawing at his neck. He couldn't breathe. His vision darkened at the edges. Luraya screamed his name, but she couldn't reach him. Xylox smirked. "And now, this ends." But then, the lights cut out. The entire room plunged into darkness. A second later, the emergency backup kicked in, bathing everything in a deep red glow. And then, the gravity stabilizers failed. Everything went weightless. Xylox's eyes widened as his grip on Daniel faltered. The warlord drifted upward, his body caught in the sudden loss of gravity. Daniel forced himself to focus, pushing through the dizziness. His body was floating, but he had trained for this. Zero-gravity combat. He twisted midair, using the momentum to slam into Xylox. The warlord grunted as they collided, spinning wildly. Daniel reached for his belt, pulling out a plasma knife. Xylox's shock turned to fury. "You think a mere knife can stop me?" Daniel didn't hesitate. He drove the blade deep into Xylox's shoulder. The warlord howled in pain, his concentration breaking. The force that had been holding Daniel weakened. "Naira," Daniel shouted. She had already moved. Using the floating debris to propel herself forward, she reached into her coat and pulled out an EMP charge. "Catch," she called, throwing it toward Daniel. He caught it, flipping it in his hands before jamming it against Psylocke's chest. The warlord's eyes widened in realization. No. Daniel activated the charge. A pulse of energy surged through the room. Psylocke screamed as his cybernetic enhancements overloaded, sparks flying from his implants. His body convulsed, his powers flickering and fading. Daniel pushed off him, sending himself floating toward Lyraya and Naira. Psylocke, weakened and disoriented, drifted helplessly in the air. His once commanding presence had crumbled. Daniel met Lyraya's eyes. Now would be a good time to get out of here. She nodded and slammed her fist on the final control switch. The gravity returned. Everything came crashing down. Psylocke hit the ground hard, the warlord groaning in pain. The station shook violently. Their sabotage had triggered a cascade failure. Naira grinned. Looks like we're not sticking around for the after-party. Alarms blared louder than before. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before the whole station collapsed. Daniel grabbed Lyraya's hand, and the three of them ran. The fight was over. Now, they just had to make it out alive. The station trembled violently, its once imposing structure now a crumbling death trap. Smoke and fire erupted from shattered consoles, sparking wires hung like broken tendrils from the ceiling, and alarms wailed with an almost desperate urgency. The entire place was falling apart. Daniel sprinted through the chaos, Lyraya's hand gripped tightly in his own, with Naira just behind them. The ship bay was close, but not close enough. Behind them, Psylocke groaned, struggling to push himself up from the debris. His once pristine robes were torn, his cybernetic implants still sparking from the EMP blast. His face was twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. For the first time, he had lost. "You think this is over?" Psylocke rasped, his voice filled with venom. He staggered to his feet, eyes locking onto them. Even in his weakened state, his presence was still terrifying. Naira swore under her breath. "This bastard just doesn't quit." Daniel didn't slow down. "We can't stop. The station's coming down. He's not our problem anymore." But Psylocke had other plans. With a final, furious snarl, he thrust his hand forward. A shockwave of energy exploded from his palm, ripping through the hallway. Daniel had no time to react. The force slammed into him like a freight train, sending him flying. His back crashed against the metal wall with a sickening crack, knocking the air from his lungs. Pain erupted through his body. Lyraya screamed his name, reaching for him. But the shockwave had separated them. She and Naira tumbled to the opposite side of the corridor. Psylocke's chest heaved with exhaustion, but his eyes still burned with hatred. He took an unsteady step forward, focusing all his remaining energy into one final deadly attack. Daniel, gasping for breath, pushed himself up. His limbs ached, his vision blurred, but he couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. Psylocke raised his hand, summoning the last of his power. The air around him crackled, glowing with an eerie, unstable light. The corridor trembled under the sheer force of it. "This is where you die, human," Psylocke growled. Daniel's mind raced. No time, no weapons, no cover. But then, a deep rumble shook the entire station. Psylocke hesitated. Daniel's eyes flickered to the walls. The metal was warping. The station's collapse had reached its final moments. The power core was failing. And then, the first explosion hit. A deafening roar tore through the structure as flames burst from the walls. The floor beneath them shook violently, metal beams collapsing from the ceiling. Psylocke's furious expression turned to one of sudden panic. Daniel knew it instantly. He was afraid. The once mighty warlord, the one who had controlled entire fleets, who had enslaved species, who had been ready to crush him like an insect, was terrified of dying. Daniel forced himself to his feet. He met Psylocke's gaze and saw the truth. "You don't want to die here," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Psylocke bared his teeth, but Daniel saw the hesitation in his eyes. "Help us get to the ship," Daniel continued, stepping forward, "or you go down with your empire." For a moment, Hylox didn't move. His pride was at war with his survival instinct. Another explosion tore through the station, sending a massive chunk of debris crashing down just inches from him. Hylox cursed, and then he made his choice. With a furious scowl, he turned and activated his wrist controls. A holographic map of the station appeared in midair, flickering from the power surges. Hylox scanned it quickly. "There's an auxiliary tunnel leading to the escape bay. It's unstable, but it's the fastest route." Daniel didn't waste time arguing. "Then let's go." Lariah and Naira had already picked themselves up, giving Daniel a look that clearly said, "Are we really trusting him?" "We don't have a choice," Daniel muttered, before sprinting after Hylox. The four of them raced through the crumbling station, dodging falling debris and leaping over gaping holes in the floor. The fire raged behind them, consuming everything in its path. The corridor buckled as another explosion hit. A massive metal beam crashed down, blocking their path. "Move," Naira shouted. Hylox, despite his injuries, grabbed the beam with his remaining strength and hurled it aside with a final burst of energy. Daniel didn't stop to think about it. They ran. The escape bay was in sight. The ship, a sleek black vessel, just large enough for them, was waiting. The doors were already open. Daniel could hear the station's final alarms blaring. Critical failure imminent. They lunged into the ship just as the walls caved in behind them. Lariah slammed the controls, and the thrusters ignited. The ship shot forward, bursting out of the station just as it finally collapsed in a massive explosion. The force of the blast sent their ship spinning, the shockwave rattling the entire cabin. Daniel gripped his seat, heart pounding as the fireball engulfed the station behind them. It was over. The station, Hylox's empire, everything, gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Hylox slumped back, staring at the wreckage of what had once been his empire, his power, his legacy, all reduced to ashes. For the first time, Daniel saw something in the warlord's expression he had never expected to see. Not anger, not hatred, but emptiness. Lariah exhaled, her hands shaking as she gripped the controls. "We made it." Naira let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "I can't believe that worked." Daniel leaned back in his seat, watching the distant flames. Then he turned to Hylox. "So," he said, "what now?" Hylox didn't answer. He just stared at the wreckage, as if searching for something, some meaning, some way to make sense of it all. But there was nothing left. For the first time in his life, Hylox had nothing. And Daniel wasn't sure if that made him dangerous or completely broken.